Tom Schaller's next, and I just want to make sure all of you are aware. He wrote a book recently called Whistling Past Dixie, I just want to say that the reason I asked Tom to come today is that when I was thinking about who could sort of put all this in context and wrap it all up, I mean, I think Tom has been one of the most astute and accurate analysts of the American electorate in recent years. I really honestly learned so much from him, and he's taught us at Indiana MPI so much in recent years. I'm very much anxious to hear what you have to say, but I'm also going to let Pete replace me for the Q&A, and I'll be hearing you from the back. Tom, thank you.
Thanks,
welcome.
Simon.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate that introduction, undeserved as it may be, and I thank Simon for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here, and it's quite a panel. What I'm going to try to do is dovetail the comments here without repeating many of the statistics, including some that I picked up that were new from each of the panelists, and I'm going to try to bring you to two, I guess, seemingly contradictory points at the end, and I'm going to get you there by sort of making 4 points about what makes a demographic group pivotal. And that may sound like such an obvious question, but I think it's one that, at least in my interactions with the media, I find that people don't often truly understand. One of the interesting things about what's going on right now, if you've been following the primary at least, is that there was that memo that was leaked out from the Obama campaign predicting which states they were going to win and which states they were going to lose. And I believe with the exception of Maine and Indiana, they are, however many states we're in, 44 now, they're 42 out of 44. And that's a pretty remarkable thing. And you think, well, how could you be so accurate about something like that? And I think what it suggests is that while demography is not destiny, while it's not completely determinative, as we might say as a social science, it's highly probabilistic. There's always going to be, female single black women who are Republicans. We have a Secretary of State, for example, who fits that billing. But in general, if you knew those three pieces of information, you'd have a pretty good sense about how that person is going to vote, especially if they have a PhD. A woman with a PhD who is single and African American is probably about 94% chance that she's a Democratic voter. So what I want to walk you through is sort of 4 things to think about in terms of what makes a group pivotal, which may seem sort of obvious at first, but I think the media often confuses, especially the second and the third one. The first, obviously, is the size of the group, and over time, the growth of that group, which is what size projected either forward or backward is. And when you think about how pivotal a group is in terms of a demographics group's power, obviously sizable groups that are also growing are going to be your sort of best targets because they're large to begin with and they're going to get larger as you move forward. And there are groups like that, including some of the groups that were discussed today, most notably Latinos, unmarrieds. Half of all women over 16 now are unmarried. They are not quite a majority of the women voters, but they will soon be because married women turn out at a higher rate, I believe, than unmarried women. But pretty soon we'll have our first election where a majority of female voters are unmarried. And I believe the percentage of men who are unmarried in this country over 16 is about 47 or 48%. So pretty soon we're going to have an unmarried male majority, and then some point beyond that, an unmarried male majority vote in the country. And overall, I think unmarried women were about 22 or 21% of the electorate. So that's a group that is growing and is sizable, along with Latinos. Next are sizable groups that aren't growing, that are sort of stagnating, and African Americans, for example, are a group like that. Sort of the population has been passed by the Latino population, but still pretty sizable. In fact, I believe in 2004, even though Latinos outnumbered African Americans, blacks still cast 5 million more votes than Latinos because, as Andres pointed out, many of the Latinos in the population are simply not of age and or they're not citizens yet. But that is going to continue to change. The ratio of people in the Latino community who are under 18 as a share of all Latinos is going to continue to shrink, and those who are citizens, whether by birth or whether by becoming, doing the process of becoming naturalized citizen, is going to increase or decrease, depending on how I frame that. And so that number is eventually going to reach a tipping point where we're going to have our first election where among non-white ethnics, Latinos are first in terms of total votes, as opposed to, I guess, second behind African Americans. Then you have groups, obviously, that are small but growing. I think of the Asian population there, about 4.2, 4.5% of the national electorate, not concentrated certainly concentrated in certain parts of the state and certain states within the country, and growing as a share of the electorate, and particularly in certain states, as George Allen learned the hard way in 2006 when he lost his seat. Virginia, the population of Asian Americans is roughly parallel to what is in the country, somewhere between 4 and 5%. but it's about 15 or 16% of Northern Virginia now. And when you're running against a former Republican with pretty strong defense credentials whose wife happens to be Asian, that can be a problem, all macaca moments notwithstanding. And then lastly, of course, you have small groups that are shrinking in the share of their population. The Jewish American population, I think, is relatively stagnant. It's very powerful in politics for a variety of other reasons, but is not really a powerful voting bloc. And there's not much talk about how the Jewish vote broke year to year for a variety of other reasons when I'll get to the other two criteria. I think it's relatively stagnant and relatively small to begin with, although its concentration in certain states and regions and districts does make it pivotal in other ways, particularly down ballot. The second criteria, obviously, is how that voting group, its size and significance is first, is how that voting group splits its vote. And this is where I think the media gets hung up on, and they tend to look at groups that split around the middle, 50-50, 60-40 groups, to the exclusion of groups that may break 70-30 or 80-20. It is important if a group is up for grabs. Why? Because if a 50-50 group is out there, that means both parties are both on offense and defense. They'd like to get some of the remaining half that they're not getting, and they're going to have to defend the half that they are getting. Whereas a group like African Americans that consistently break 90-10 in general elections and recently in this Democratic primary, one group is clearly, one party I should say, or one coalition is clearly on offense, and the other is on defense if it needs to be on defense. And so there's a lot of room for growth, at least in theory, for Republicans among black voters, and you do hear some smart Republicans talking about that, where there's not really much room for growth for Democrats among the African American vote, and so they tend to be discounted. And so I think the media tends to focus on groups that are in and around the 50-50, 60-40 split to the exclusion of groups that are 65-35, 75-25. But again, that risks the problem on the third. That risks the problem on the third criterion. Then what's the third criteria? Which is how volatile the group is, right? How much it changes year against. A group that's 50-50 and is 50-50 every election might get a lot of attention, even though it's not really moving that much. Whereas a group like Latinos, which is hovering between maybe on the high end 80-20 and maybe on the low end in Bush's reelection 60-40, that's a very volatile group that should get more attention, right? Because it's kind of near the middle, but it's also highly volatile. A group that's moving between 90-10 and 70-30 is far more pivotal, it's far more critical than a group that's 50-50 year in and year out. That's highly divided, but not very volatile in terms of its electoral behavior. Okay? And then fourthly is the geographic concentration, which I've alluded to. And that can sort of, I think of that as in a curved or linear relationship. I mean, concentration can benefit you. You wouldn't want to be too diffuse, especially if you're a small group. It's good for Cubans that they're concentrated in one county, mostly, in one part of one state that happens to be a pivotal state. Whereas if they were highly concentrated in Utah by some crazy twist of fate, we wouldn't really talk about Elian Gonzalez, right? It wouldn't be important because there's no elections to be swung there. So concentration can benefit you, and all else equal, it tends to benefit you if you are small because you can at least have some influence in some ways, like the Jewish vote is, which is concentrated in New York metropolitan states and other parts of the country. On the other hand, diffusion can also help you, and obviously the most diffuse group is women, right? They're relatively evenly distributed across every single precinct, county, block, state, and across the country, with some minor exceptions. And so diffusion can also help because you're everywhere and your voters are everywhere. And so there's no clear direct relationship between groups being more pivotal if they're concentrated or more pivotal if they're diffuse. And I think obviously in terms of what Andres is saying, you have concentrations of Latinos, particularly in the Southwest, and some states that I think some people are surprised about, like Connecticut's and Utah's and Illinois, where there are significant Latino populations as well. And then you have power also to be found when your vote is diffuse, like women and certainly young voters aren't really that much off the normal distribution in terms of where they live in the country. Obviously some younger voters move to the urban areas and so forth, but essentially age groups are relatively uniformly distributed. So when you when you sort of look across those four criteria, what are large groups that are growing? What are groups that are, both parties are in play because they're both on offense and defense in sort of the 60-40 range or closer, and are also volatile in terms of they move from election to election, and their geographic either concentration or diffusion makes them pivotal. I mean, one of the groups that I mentioned all 4 points is Latinos, right? Latinos are a growing bloc. The growth rate is going to be pretty dramatic. They are concentrated in a way that they can have power over certain, but they're starting to become more diffuse. And they are a group that sort of hovers between 60-40 and maybe on the upper end 80-20. That's why Latinos, not to sort of stroke the project here that the NDN works on very intensely and I think very successfully. I can stroke? Okay, I mean, that's why the Latino vote is important and why it gets a lot of attention, though I think it actually probably gets less attention in national political discussions than working class white voters do, for example, to sort of bring in recent headlines. And so obviously no group, very few groups are sort of critical on all of those sort of criteria of pivotalness, but the more you are, the more pivotal your group is going to become. And I think, unfortunately, too oftentimes the attention sort of gets bogged down in sort of, working class, lunch pail white men who aren't really moving that much. And even though they're pretty sizable, they may or may not be as pivotal as people think they are. The big problem here in any election is that when an election is close, you can point to almost any group and say they're pivotal, much in the way that if the Wizards win at the buzzer 199 and Gilbert Arenas drops in 40 points, including the game-winning three-pointer, you clearly can say he was pivotal, but you could also talk about, somebody will find, some sub who came in and sank 2 free throws in the middle of the second quarter and call that person pivotal, because in a one-point game, those 2 free throws, I guess, are technically pivotal. I think we tend to get too focused on groups that seem like they're more pivotal than they are not. Now, let me bring you to the 2 points at the end that are contradictory, I think, but are certainly related. The 2 books that most influenced the writing of my book, and I had the opportunity to actually sit down and have dinner with Kevin Phillips a couple of weeks ago in New York for a Harper's Magazine thing where they get you together and they tape the conversation and run it as an article. His book, The Emerging Republican Majority, written 40 years ago, was probably one of the single most important influences of me in thinking about how to write Whistling Past Dixie. And the other, which was obviously influenced by Kevin Phillips' book, was John Judas's and Rui Teixeira's book, The Emerging Democratic Majority, which is essentially a takeoff on their book. And the thing that people like Judas and Teixeira are talking about, and I think I'm talking about, is this notion of how much is demography really going to determine the politics of the country and the emerging coalitions, and whether we're going to have a realignment here and have a majority party in the near future. And I think when we hear these presentations, it's easy to be very hopeful about that. I think it's, if you sort of were able to take American politics at just a moment in time and sort of comparative statics, as we call it in social science, and you're able to hold constant all the variables that factor into American politics, the quality of the candidates, the amount of money that the parties have, their messages and themes, the positions of the candidates, the positions of the voters. If you're able to hold every other factor constant and just start the population trends moving forward, the Democrats could literally do nothing and they would eventually become a majority party, because almost all of the demographic trends, with a few exceptions, like some rising evangelicalism, even though we're becoming an increasingly secular country overall. The growth of exurbs, for example, even though there's quite a bit of growth in urban and inner suburban areas. But basically, on the whole, the demographics of the country, if you just started that, like in a model, and let that run forward and held everything else constant, the Democrats could just sit back and wait for their majority to come to them. And I think part of what Rui Teixeira and John Judas were saying, and what I'm saying, is that's certainly true. And so the unfortunate part of that is I think it can engender a false complacency, that all we have to do is keep saying the things that we're saying, and the Democratic majority will sort of present itself. On the other hand, and sort of the converse of this, is that I sometimes think people take a very dim view about the prospects for the future, that there's sort of an unjustified fear about the Democrats blowing it or the left blowing it in the long term. And I think that's a little bit overwrought, precisely because of the demographic trends that are happening with the youth vote, that are happening with the women vote, that are happening with the Latino vote. I mean, the Democrats are clearly in the favored position. This is a country where, with each passing election, it becomes a more feminized electorate, right? 54% of all votes cast by women last election. And the breaks are even more dramatic. I mean, the African-American communities are like 59-41. It's becoming a more multicultural election. I mean, 6% of votes were cast by non-whites in 1952, and it's now 22%. It's becoming increasingly unmarried. It's becoming an increasingly secular. And with the exception of maybe unionization and the exurbanization, on almost every factor you can think of, those trends favor the Democrats and favor the left in the long term. And so there should be a hopefulness, but I guess I want to say a cautious hopefulness that doesn't move into the area of complacency to the point where you think the Democrats don't need to do anything, because it's not enough to simply let the population changes. You do need to go out and persuade. You do need to go out and convert. You do need to go out and try to win these voters, and and as some of the panelists are saying, and to keep these voters for the longer term. And that is a larger project that has to happen, because elections happen at discrete moments in times, and it's as easy as it is to convert voters, it is often just as easy to lose them. And so in closing, what I'll say, since I'm out of time, is that demography is still very probabilistic. It's still very strong predictor, but it's never deterministic, and these things are in flux. And so while I think on the whole, when you step back and take the broader picture, things look pretty good, complacency can be a real self-destructive kind of notion as you're trying to build and try to realign the party system to have a progressive majority that's durable and powerful and strong enough of a majority to really change American politics in the next couple of decades.
Wow, thank you, Tom. Let's give a candidate.